From glowing eyes in the fog to creatures that defy explanation, these 6 isolated towns have seen animals no one can identify. And the sightings will leave you questioning reality. Welcome to TerrorMouth, where the night doesn't just hold secrets, it remembers them. Story 1. The thing that walked like a deer. Ridgway Flats, Montana, was the kind of town people forgot existed. One long road, a diner that closed before dark, and endless forests pressing in from every side. There was no phone signal, no streetlights past the last house, and no reason to be outside once the sun disappeared behind the hills. People said it was because of wild animals, but the truth was worse. It began with the goats, one morning. Rancher Paul Henley found 3 of them lying near the tree line. Their bodies were untouched, no torn flesh, no blood spilled, but their necks were twisted at impossible angles. Their eyes were wide open, frozen in terror. The ground around them was marked with hoof prints, but they were wrong. Too deep, too uneven, and they ended abruptly, as if whatever made them had simply lifted itself off the earth. Paul buried the goats without calling anyone. In Ridgway Flats, you didn't report things that didn't make sense. The first people to really see it were kids. 14-year-old Caleb Norris was walking home with his 10-year-old sister Megan just after dusk. The sky was still faintly orange when they heard heavy breathing coming from the trees beside the dirt road. Slow, steady, close. Caleb assumed it was an elk. Then it stepped out of the trees. At first glance, it looked like a deer, tall and thin, its pale brown fur stretched tightly over long limbs. But its head was wrong. Too long, too narrow. The eyes were set forward like a person's, not to the sides like an animal's. And then it stood up. Its back legs straightened first, bending the wrong way at the joints. Then the front legs unfolded, rising higher and higher until the thing towered over them, nearly 9 feet tall. Its spine cracked softly as it adjusted to standing upright. Megan screamed. The creature tilted its head, studying them. Its mouth pulled back slowly, stretching far wider than it should have. Deer didn't smile, but this thing did. Rows of uneven teeth filled its mouth, some flat, some sharp, as if they hadn't decided what kind of creature they belonged to. Its eyes locked onto Caleb, not like an animal hunting prey, like something recognizing him. It opened its mouth and made a sound, half breath, half voice, like air being forced through a throat that had never learned how to speak. Caleb grabbed Megan's hand and ran. Behind them came footsteps. Not hooves, bare feet slapping against dirt, keeping pace no matter how fast they ran. The sound only stopped when they crossed under the old railroad arch at the edge of town. When Caleb looked back, the road was empty. No deer, no creature, no tracks, just a smell lingering in the air, wet fur mixed with rusted metal and something sour, like rotting meat. That night, Megan refused to sleep with the lights off. At exactly 2:17 a.m., Caleb woke to a faint scratching sound outside his bedroom window. Slow, patient. When he forced himself to look, he saw marks in the dirt below, deep and clear. Beside them were barefoot human footprints. Over the next few days, whispers spread through Ridgway Flats. A teacher claimed she saw something tall standing at the edge of the school playground just before sunset. A hunter said he was followed for miles through the woods, hearing steady breathing right behind him but never seeing anything. A woman swore a deer stood upright outside her barn one night, knocking softly on the door with something shaped like a hand, always near the forest, always at dusk, always stopping at the edge of town. as if it was obeying a rule no one remembered making on the seventh night. The power went out across Ridgeway Flats. No storm, no wind, just sudden darkness. Caleb and Megan sat in their living room with candles burning low when they heard slow footsteps outside the house. Something brushed against the siding, followed by the sound of breathing, deep and close. Then a voice whispered from just beyond the wall. Caleb's voice. "Caleb, come outside." The back door handle began to turn, not violently, carefully, as if whatever stood outside had learned how doors worked. Caleb pulled Megan back, his heart pounding outside. The breathing stopped. There was a soft knock on the glass once, twice, 3 times, and then the voice spoke again, calmer than before. "I learned your name." The knock came again, slow, deliberate. Caleb stood frozen, every muscle locked as the back door handle turned just a fraction more. Megan pressed her face into his shirt, shaking so hard he could feel her teeth chattering. The candle flame bent toward the door as if the air itself were being pulled outside. Then the handle stopped. The voice spoke again, closer now, no longer trying to sound like Caleb. Its tone slipped, stretched, as if the words were being remembered rather than spoken. Wrong shape, wrong sound. Footsteps moved along the side of the house, bare feet scraping softly over gravel. The breathing followed the sound, circling, learning. Caleb forced himself to move. He pulled Megan into the hallway and locked them both inside the bathroom, the only room without a window facing the woods. They sat in the dark, holding their breath. Listening, outside, something sniffed along the walls. Then came a new sound. Scratchings, careful lines being carved into the wood, not by claws, but by something testing how hard it needed to press. The scratching stopped beneath Caleb's bedroom window. Silence stretched so long it hurt. Then the voice returned, almost gentle now. "Megan, are you cold?" She whimpered. Caleb clamped a hand over her mouth. The thing had learned her name too. After a long time, the footsteps retreated. The smell lingered, wet fur and metal seeping through the cracks of the house. When dawn finally came, the woods stood quiet, innocent again. But the marks were there, deep grooves in the siding beneath Caleb's window, hoof prints and barefoot tracks circling the house, and carved into the dirt near the back door, as if written by a finger dragged slowly through the soil, were the words, "Stand still next to either." Sheriff called it an animal. Said it was probably a sick elk. The adults nodded and pretended to believe him. The kids didn't, because they noticed something else. The forest line had moved. Not much, just a few feet closer to the houses than it had been before. That week, a boy named Aaron went missing while walking home from basketball practice. His backpack was found near the trees, straps torn, shoes placed neatly beside it. There were no tracks leading away, only deep hoof prints that ended suddenly, and barefoot prints that began in their place. After that, the town stopped pretending. People nailed boards over windows facing the woods. They brought animals inside at night. No one walked alone after sunset. Parents taught their children a new rule, whispered like a prayer. If you hear your name outside, no matter how real it sounds, do not answer. But the thing kept learning. It learned voices from open windows, learned names from mailboxes, learned schedules. It began appearing closer to town before dusk, sometimes standing motionless at the tree line, imagining what it might look like to pass as human. One evening, Caleb saw it from his bedroom window. It stood just beyond the last tree, upright, unmoving. Its head was tilted, watching the houses. Its arms hung too long at its sides, fingers brushing the grass. When it opened its mouth, its lips twitched, practicing expressions that didn't belong to it. Then it raised a hand and waved Caleb. Slammed the curtain shut the next morning. His parents told him they were leaving Ridgeway Flats. They didn't explain why. They didn't have to. Half the town was already packing. For sale signs appeared overnight. Though no one was buying, the forest had crept closer again on their last night. As the moving trucks sat loaded in the driveway, Caleb couldn't sleep. At 2:17 a.m., the scratching returned right on time. But this time, it wasn't outside. It was in the walls. The breathing came from every direction, slow and pleased. The voice whispered through the house, no longer copying anyone else. "I almost fit," it said. "I just need more time." Caleb didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink when the sun rose. The house was quiet. They left at dawn and never came back. Years later, the road into Ridgeway Flats was blocked off. The town no longer appears on maps. The forest reclaimed the houses, the school, the diner dash, everything. Hunters passing too close still report seeing something tall standing among the trees at dusk. Something shaped almost right, and sometimes just before night fully falls. It practices walking on two legs, learning how to follow the road out. Story 2. The Silent Ones of Ravens Hollow, deep in the Appalachian folds, where the mist clings to the mountains like a shroud and the old-growth trees whisper secrets older than the towns themselves. There lies Ravens Hollow. It's a place you don't stumble upon by accident. On maps, it exists only as a faded smudge, barely labeled, as if the cartographers themselves didn't want to remember it. The cluster of clapboard houses huddled around the cracked asphalt of Blackroot Road. The solitary general store with its peeling paint and dusty windows. The abandoned church, steeper leaning precariously over the cemetery. All of it bore the weight of decades of silence and suspicion. The people who lived there were quiet, hardened by isolation, wary of strangers, and steeped in folklore older than the hills themselves. Ghost stories weren't just tales in Ravens. Hollow, they were warnings. It was late September when the first whispers began. Whispered behind locked doors, behind curtains drawn tightly against the creeping fog. The story centered on the Miller family, who had recently moved into a centuries-old farmhouse at the end of a narrow gully. Sarah and Ben Miller had sought solitude here, believing the myths of Ravens Hollow to be quaint, harmless superstition. Their daughter Lily, 8, had grown up in the city, used to noise and motion, and had yet to understand what it meant for a town to live with the forest breathing so close that it seemed to touch your windows at night. The story began with the dogs. Old Man Hemlock, a recluse who lived halfway up the ridge, had the best coonhounds in 3 counties. They could track a rabbit through 10 miles of underbrush in an afternoon and always returned with a soft, satisfied bark. But on that Tuesday night, nothing stirred. No whine, no growl, no rustle in the kennel. The next morning, Hemlock found them huddled in their own shadows. Tails tucked so far between their legs, it seemed they were trying to fold themselves in half, as though to make themselves disappear. Their fur was matted with dew, trembling with an unseen dread, eyes fixed on the edge of the woods beyond the property line. They would not eat. They would not respond to their names. They only stared, unblinking, into the forest. And those who knew the land knew that no dog can hold a gaze that long without seeing something unnatural. The first human sighting followed swiftly. Eli Vance, a young mechanic, was driving his rusted, beat-up truck home along the serpentine curves of Black Root Road, the fog thick enough to dampen headlights into a dull, smeared glow. He had just passed the old wooden bridge where the creek whispered underneath when something caught his eye not on the road, but at the tree line, matching the speed of his vehicle. He slowed, straining to see. What stepped out was something tall and impossibly thin, gliding between the trunks without rustling a branch, without breaking a single twig. Its foreskin was bone-white, stretched tight over an emaciated frame. At first, he thought of a greyhound, but no greyhound could stand upright, on legs bent backward at impossible angles, and no greyhound would have a smooth, featureless face. The thing had no eyes, no mouth, just a terrifyingly blank visage that seemed to absorb the dim light of his headlights. Then another appeared, and another, 3 of them, standing perfectly still at the edge of the trees, heads cocked in perfect unison. Eli's hands shook on the steering wheel as adrenaline surged, but the worst part wasn't the sight, it was the silence. Not even the scraping of claws on asphalt, not even a breath, just a void where sound should have been. When he hit the gas, they didn't retreat. They didn't chase. They simply watched, gliding alongside his truck, faceless and impossible. By the 3rd night after Eli's encounter, the Miller family became the epicenter of the Hollow's awakening terror. Their farmhouse, surrounded by centuries-old trees, sat like a sentinel at the edge of the gully. The fog rolled in thick that night, silver and heavy, obscuring the world beyond the windows. The generator sputtered and died with a definitive, guttural thump, leaving the house in complete darkness. Sarah clutched Lily, who pressed against her chest, murmuring questions about shadows and shapes she couldn't see. Ben held his rifle, knuckles white against the polished wood, eyes scanning the fog-laden tree line, a hunter's instincts battling with rising dread. Then came the silence. It wasn't just the absence of wind or crickets. It was absolute living, pressing nothing that filled the corners of the house and seemed to cling to their skin. It was heavier than air, more oppressive than cold. Even Lily, accustomed to night noises, trembled, her small voice breaking the quiet. "Mummy, the scarecrows are looking at us." But there were no scarecrows. Not a single one. Ben crept to the window. Through the dim glow of their kerosene lamp, the fog took shape. A pale form resolved, first taller than a man, limbs impossibly long, head smooth and featureless. One more appeared beside it, and then another. In a semicircle at the boundary of their property, the faceless creatures watched. For hours, the Millers sat frozen. Each second stretched like an eternity. Time itself seemed to bend around the presence of those silent watchers. Breathing became a conscious act, deliberate and careful, lest they provoke attention. The creatures didn't move, didn't make a noise. They simply existed, a void pressing into the room, teaching fear. Then Lily whimpered. The moment a sound emerged, every creature snapped its head toward her. It was no longer passive observation, it was focus, targeting. The movements were swift, unnatural like machinery, gliding rather than stepping, joints bending in ways that defied logic. The Millers' hearts pounded. Ben fired his rifle into the air, the sharp report shattering the oppressive quiet, forcing the things to pause mid. The fog seemed to ripple, and then, slowly, they dissolved back into the grey. leaving nothing behind but silence and the lingering scent of wet earth and iron. Dawn arrived, but sleep did not. The Millers packed a single bag and drove until their gas tank was empty. Police dismissed their account as hysteria, misidentified wildlife, or even mass stress-induced hallucination. Yet those who had lived in Raven's Hollow for generations knew better. They knew the dogs still went quiet on certain nights, and travelers occasionally glimpsed pale forms at the tree line, faceless and silent, observing, always observing. The hollow had secrets, and some of them never left. Asterisk. Even after leaving the farmhouse, the Millers weren't free. The hollow seemed to follow them. Each turn of the road, each shadow at the edge of the tree line, carried the weight of unseen eyes. The silence from that night clung to their ears, replaying like a low-frequency hum, an echo of a sound that had never truly existed. They drove until the sun rose high, painting the mountains in warm hues that could have comforted anyone else. But for the Millers, even the daylight carried a lingering unease. Shadows moved in impossible ways, and the rustle of leaves sounded like whispers. At every stop, the gas stations, diners, and motels, they were watched. By what they did not know, but the feeling was unmistakable. Back in Raven's Hollow, the story had already spread. Rumors traveled faster than any resident could speak. The townfolk whispered about other strange events, the dog killings, the sightings along Black Root Road, but these had never reached this intensity before. Children began reporting shapes in the fog, pale, elongated forms that glided instead of walked, their faceless heads tilting in perfect unison. People swore they could hear the sound of voices mimicking loved ones calling from the tree line. One family claimed that the shadows of their farmhands, long dead, appeared in the fog and beckoned them toward the woods. The hollow itself seemed alive, responding to fear. Windows rattled when a scream pierced the night. The fog rolled thicker around those who panicked, and even the wind seemed to whisper warnings that went unheeded. Travelers began to avoid the roads entirely, leaving Raven's Hollow, isolated as if it had been cut off from the rest of the world. The Millers tried to rebuild a semblance of normalcy in a neighboring county, but the Silent Ones were patient. They learned to hunt in other ways. The first encounter came on a quiet evening when Lily went out to retrieve the mail. A thin figure, pale and impossible, moved along the edge of the yard. Its legs bent backward, head smooth and unbroken. It stood still, merely observing. Lily screamed, dropping the letters. Her mother ran out, rifle in hand, but the figure didn't flee. Instead, it tilted its head and vanished into the night fog. No footprints remained. No trace of passage. That night, the Millers barricaded the house. Every window was covered, every door locked, but sleep was impossible. Outside, the fog pressed closer, and faint shapes so thin and pale moved at the very edge of perception. They seemed to study, to measure, to understand. And then the whispers began, not loud, not audible to strangers, but Lily swore she could hear her name repeated softly, over and over, in the tones of someone familiar. Ben investigated, flashlight in hand, but found nothing. The yard was empty, yet the air felt charged with intent. Something was waiting, learning. The creatures didn't need to attack. Observation was enough. Weeks passed, and the Millers learned to live with the tension. They never went out after dark, never spoke above a whisper after sunset, and never made noise that could betray their presence. But then the Silent Ones escalated. One night, Sarah awoke to Lily's small voice calling softly from the hall. "Mummy, Daddy." The words were drawn out, careful, deliberate. Sarah froze, realizing Lily was asleep in her room. Ben grabbed the rifle instinctively, heart hammering. The fog outside thickened, pressing against the windows as if drawn by the sound. And then the shapes appeared, dozens, now, not just a semicircle, but a formation, gliding through the mist, faceless heads tilting in unison. They entered the yard silently. They did not touch the house, yet the oppressive silence followed. It was more than quiet. It was a physical weight, a void pressing down on lungs, minds, and hearts. Ben fired a warning shot, shattering the glass in one window. The creatures froze, as if caught in a spell, then vanished into the mist without a sound, leaving behind the faint metallic tang of fear. After that night, the Millers realized there was no true safety. The silent ones didn't chase, didn't consume, they learned. They waited. They studied. And they remembered. Any sound, any slip, any whimper could draw them closer. The final confrontation came months later. The family had moved again, trying to settle in a small town at the edge of the hollow. But the creatures followed. One evening, Ben noticed hoof-like indentations in the mud behind the property to deep, too precise to be any animal. Then he saw it, a pale, elongated form standing beyond the fence line, its blank face directed toward the house. Others emerged from the fog, forming a loose circle around the property. The Millers were trapped. The creatures did not move like animals, and yet there was movement, fluid, deliberate, unearthly. They were testing boundaries, pushing edges, calculating. It was Lily who drew the line. She had grown accustomed to their presence, but that night she refused to be silent. She stepped forward, small but unyielding, staring into the faceless void. "We are not afraid," she said, her voice trembling yet clear. The creatures froze. For the first time, they paused as if considering. Then one, the tallest, bent its head closer, tilting unnaturally. And then, slowly, it stepped back. Others followed. They didn't vanish, but lingered at the periphery, like ghosts who had learned patience. The hollow was quiet again. But the lesson was clear. The silent ones were always listening, always learning, and always waiting. They didn't need to hunt. Fear was enough. Noise drew them near. Curiosity beckoned them closer. And even the bravest human heart was a beacon. Even now, in Raven's Hollow, on the foggiest of nights, dogs fall silent. Travelers report strange movements at the tree line, pale forms that tilt their blank faces in unison. The hollow whispers its secrets, older than the mountains themselves, carrying a warning across the wind. Do not make a sound. Do not be noticed. And if you hear your name, do not answer, because the silent ones are always listening. And someday they might finally decide that what they've observed is no longer enough. Story 3. The Howling Shadows of Maple Ridge. Maple Ridge was the kind of town that didn't exist on GPS maps. Nestled deep in the forests of northern Maine, it was a cluster of faded red barns, wooden clapboard houses, and a single gas station that hadn't been repainted since the 1970s. The air smelled of pine and cold rain, and the fog that rolled in off the mountains never fully lifted, leaving the town in a perpetual, muted twilight. Locals called it picturesque, outsiders called it eerie, and for those who dared venture into the surrounding woods at night, it was deadly. The first unusual sighting came in late October, when the leaves had turned brittle and golden, and the nights had begun to stretch long and silent. Thomas Avery, a logger who had worked the forest for nearly 30 years, was driving home along the old logging road when he noticed movement among the shadows. At first he assumed it was deer, a common enough sight in the area, but as he slowed his truck, his headlights illuminated a creature that defied every law of nature. It was massive, taller than a full-grown moose, but its body was unnaturally thin, sinewy, and covered in bristly, dark fur that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Its limbs were long and spindly, and it moved with an unholy grace, gliding across the underbrush without disturbing a single leaf. The head was elongated, wolf-like, but the eyes glowed a faint amber, intelligent and calculating, fixed directly on Thomas. The creature tilted its head in a way no animal could, and then it let out a low, almost musical howl that didn't belong to any known species. Thomas's stomach churned. He pressed the gas and drove home, but the howl followed him, echoing in the fog long after the creature had vanished from sight. The next encounter occurred at the town's edge, near the abandoned railway tracks that led into the forest. A group of teenagers, daring each other to explore the night, spotted a pair of glowing eyes in the trees. At first, they thought it was coyotes or foxes, but then the creatures emerged. Two of them, nearly identical, moved on all fours with impossible speed, limbs bending backward in a way that should have been physically impossible. Their fur was black as midnight, and their jaws opened unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged, serrated teeth. The teens ran screaming, tripping over roots and rocks, leaving their bikes behind. When they looked back, the creatures had vanished, leaving only the silence of the forest. By November, the sightings escalated. Farmers reported their livestock being killed, not eaten, but dismembered in a precise and deliberate manner. Cows were found split down the middle, sheep's wool shredded as if pulled off in sheets, and every carcass bore markings claw-like scratches forming strange, almost geometric patterns. Hounds refused to leave their kennels, howling into the fog, unnerved by something only they could sense. And always, a sound preceded the disappearances, the low, musical howl that no human ear could mistake for anything familiar. The town's sheriff, a man named Walter Grimes, was a practical man, not easily spooked, but even he began to change. At night, he would patrol the outskirts with a shotgun, eyes scanning the mist. He swore he saw the creatures watching him, tall and thin, stepping through the fog like shadows come to life. Once, he reported, one of them approached the patrol car slowly, its glowing eyes following him as he retreated. The next morning, he found the tire tracks on the dirt road warped, twisted in impossible angles, as though the vehicle itself had been bent by unseen hands. The true terror came for the Holloway family. They lived at the far end of the forest, in a log cabin surrounded by towering pines. One evening, young Emily Holloway, just 8 years old, was outside gathering firewood. The fog had rolled in thick and wet, limiting visibility to less than 20 feet. From the corner of her eye, she noticed a figure tall, black, and impossibly thin gliding silently between the trees. Before she could scream, another figure appeared behind her, and then another, until she was surrounded. Each creature tilted its head in unison, and the glowing amber eyes fixed on her. She ran screaming toward the cabin, but when her father, Samuel, rushed outside, there was no one there. Nothing. The fog had swallowed them completely, leaving only the scent of wet pine and iron in the air. That night, the Holloways barricaded every window and door. They could hear it, the musical howl echoing from the woods, circling their cabin as though taunting them. when they dared to peek through cracks in the curtains. They saw shadows moving between the trees, precise and deliberate, gliding closer with each pass. Sleep was impossible, fear their constant companion. By the time the first snow fell, the town was on edge. Sightings increased in frequency. Hunters reported footprints that changed shapes, sometimes canine, sometimes humanoid, sometimes something entirely alien. The creatures seemed to learn, adapting to human behavior. People stopped traveling at night, and children were kept indoors, told not to speak above whispers once the fog rolled in. And always, at the edge of hearing, there was the howl, sometimes soft, sometimes loud, but always intelligent, deliberate, and terrifying. Locals began to speculate. Some said it was an experiment gone wrong, government creatures released into the wild. Others whispered of ancient spirits, guardians of the forest angered by the intrusion of humans. But no theory explained what the creatures were learning, or why they seemed drawn to observation rather than consumption. The hollow had become a place where curiosity was deadly, and silence was the only form of protection. The story ends on a warning. If you find yourself traveling through the foggy forests of northern Maine, if the road winds and the mist thickens, keep your eyes forward and your voice low, because the howling shadows of Maple Ridge are always listening, always watching, and patient beyond comprehension. And when they finally decide to act, it will be swift, precise, and impossible to escape. Asterisk. The Holloway family never fully recovered from that first night. The fog seemed to follow them, curling around their cabin with a sentience of its own. Samuel Holloway fortified every window with plywood, nailed doors shut, and lit lanterns all around the perimeter, but nothing could keep the shadows at bay. The creatures didn't need to enter. They didn't need to touch. Observation alone was enough to instill dread so profound it seeped into dreams. Waking and sleeping alike, Emily, the youngest, began speaking of things she shouldn't know. She would whisper to her mother about shapes in the fog, naming the creatures as if they were old acquaintances. The tall one, the one with amber eyes, it's watching us again. Her words chilled Sarah Holloway to the bone, and even Samuel, a lifelong woodsman, began doubting his own senses. The forest itself seemed alive, moving with intent. Footsteps on the snow outside, soft and precise, didn't belong to any animal Samuel recognized. They came from multiple directions, sometimes simultaneously, yet always vanished when approached. One night, the fog rolled in thicker than ever, suffocating the forest in a dense, grey blanket. Emily had gone to bed early, but Sarah noticed a soft glow emanating from her room. Peeking in, she froze. A shadow, impossibly tall and thin, leaned just outside the window. Its head was featureless, smooth and tilted at an unnatural angle, eyes glowing faint amber. Sarah screamed, and the creature vanished in a swirl of mist before Samuel could reach her. Word of these sightings spread, and a small group of townsfolk decided to take matters into their own hands. Hunters, trappers, and a retired military tracker, known locally as Jed Carlson, armed themselves and ventured into the forest. The night was black and silent, the fog so thick that their flashlights barely penetrated 10 feet. Then the howls began. Not a chorus, but a single, melodic wail that seemed to emanate from every direction at once. The hunters froze. The sound was neither animal nor human, and it carried an intelligence, a deliberate intent that sent shivers down their spines. Suddenly, shapes moved at the edge of visibility, tall, sinewy forms gliding across the snow. limbs bending backward, skin black and absorbent of light. They didn't attack, not immediately. They circled. They observed. Jed Carlson fired a single shot into the night, and for a moment everything froze. Then the shadows moved faster than any human or animal could, retreating into the fog and leaving behind twisted tracks that didn't align with the laws of physics. It was as though the forest itself had warped around the creatures, bending reality to their will. Back in the Holloway cabin, Emily's nightmares became more vivid. She described being carried into the fog, surrounded by the shadows, yet feeling no fear, only observation. "They want to know us," she whispered one night. "They're learning." Samuel tried to rationalize it as dreams induced by fear, but even he could hear the faint echoes of the musical howl, sometimes mimicking his own name from beyond the tree line by winter. The hollow's presence was undeniable. Livestock disappeared entirely, leaving only traces of strange geometric patterns scratched into the snow and ground. Hunters who ventured too far into the fog were never seen again. The town grew quieter, more secretive. Children were kept indoors, and all travelers avoided the logging roads after dusk. Any who disobeyed reported hearing whispers calling their names, faint laughter, or melodic howls that left them paralyzed with fear. The Holloway family realized that confrontation would be inevitable. One night, as fog thickened around the cabin, Samuel set traps and lit flares along the perimeter. The shadows responded. They moved with calculated precision, avoiding every trap, every flare, their glowing eyes following every motion. It was no longer a game of survival. It was a test, a learning process. The creatures observed patterns, memorized movements, and adapted, their intelligence far beyond anything humans could comprehend. Emily, brave beyond her years, began to communicate. She would mimic the musical howls, experimenting with tones and rhythm. To everyone's horror, the creatures responded. They circled closer, paused, and emitted a harmony of sound that filled the fog with an unnatural resonance. It was as if they were teaching her or testing her. One night, she repeated a pattern of notes that caused the shadows to freeze completely, their forms flickering as though caught between dimensions. For the first time, the Holloway family felt a strange mix of relief and terror. The creatures could be influenced, but they were infinitely patient. The final confrontation came in the dead of winter. A blizzard had trapped the family inside their cabin. The howls were closer than ever. Shadows glided just beyond the fogged windows, sometimes pressing against the glass without leaving a mark, other times vanishing only to reappear in another corner. Samuel and Jed Carlson, who had joined forces with the Holloways, tried every conventional weapon, firearms, traps, flares, but nothing worked. The creatures were not made of flesh alone. They were a force, an intelligence that could manipulate the environment itself. Emily, standing at the window, raised her hands and whispered a melody, a rhythm she had developed over weeks of observation. The shadows halted, their featureless faces tilted, their glowing eyes locking onto her. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, they retreated, dissolving into the fog. Silence returned. But the message was clear. They were always watching, always learning, and always patient by spring. Maple Ridge was quiet again, but the forest retained its secrets. Locals whispered of strange movements in the fog, of howls that echoed without source, and of glowing eyes glimpsed at the edges of perception. The Holloway family left Maple Ridge permanently, but the shadows remained, guardians of the forest, observing every sound, every movement, every breath, and so the legend persists. The howling shadows of Maple Ridge are neither predators nor spirits. They are watchers. They do not attack unless provoked, but curiosity, noise, or fear draws them closer. And when they finally act, it is swift, silent. An absolute warning to anyone passing through Maple Ridge is simple. Stay inside when the fog rolls in. Make no sound, and if you hear a howl mimicking your name, do not answer, because the howling shadows are always listening, always learning, and they never forget. Story 4. The Whispering Moths of Raven's Hollow. Our story begins with Elias Vance, a reclusive woodcarver in his late 60s, a man who preferred the company of pine and walnut to people. His cabin sat on the very edge of the hemlock woods, the one place in Raven's Hollow that even lifelong residents spoke of in whispers. They called it the quiet place, not because it was silent, but because the sounds there were. Wrong, it started subtly. Elias began finding small, dead songbirds on his porch each morning, not mangled by a cat or a hawk. They were perfectly intact, save for one bizarre detail. Their eyes were gone, not pecked out, but seemingly dissolved. He dismissed it as the work of insects, though a cold knot of unease tightened in his stomach. Then the sounds began. Elias would be working in his shop, the rhythmic scrape of his chisel the only noise when he'd hear it, a faint, sibilant whisper, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It seemed to come from just outside the window. At first, he wrote it off as the wind, but the whispers had a pattern, a cadence that felt almost linguistic. He'd rush outside, heart hammering, only to be met with profound silence. The true horror began on a night shrouded in a thick pea-soup fog. Elias was awakened by a soft, persistent tapping on his bedroom window. He froze, his blood turning to ice. It wasn't the random tapping of a branch. It was deliberate, intelligent, summoning every ounce of courage. He crept to the window and peeled back the curtain. The outside pane was covered in moths, dozens of them. But these were like no moths he, or anyone, had ever seen. They were the size of his palm, with wings of a velvet absolute black that seemed to swallow the faint moonlight. But it was their markings that stole the breath from his lungs. On the back of each wing was a pattern that didn't look like a pattern at all. It looked like a human eye, rendered in iridescent silver scales, and they were all staring in at him as he stood there. Paralyzed, the whispering began again. But this time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside his own head. A soft multitude of voices, layered over one another, speaking in a language he couldn't understand, yet felt he almost could. It was the sound of madness given voice. He stumbled back from the window, clamping his hands over his ears, but it did nothing to block the psychic intrusion. The whispers were promising things, secrets of the wood, the location of a long-lost silver vein his grandfather had searched for. They knew his deepest, most private thoughts. Terrified, he grabbed a flashlight and burst out of his front door, waving the beam wildly. The moths didn't scatter. They turned their eye-marked wings in unison, following the light, and the whispers in his mind coalesced into a single, clear, chilling sentence. "We see you. Elias, we have always seen you." He fled inside, barricaded the door, and spent the night in a quivering ball of terror. The whispers are constant, tormenting presence at the edge of his consciousness. The next day, sleep-deprived and trembling, he went into town to the only diner, the Hollowed Grounds. He tried to tell old Sheriff Miller, his words tumbling out in a frantic, incoherent jumble about talking moths with eyes on their wings. The sheriff, a man whose patience was as worn thin as the town's pavement, listened with a skeptical frown. "Elias, you've been out there by yourself too long. It's the fog. Plays tricks on the mind. Probably just some big lunar moths. They look strange in the dark." But the town's librarian, a young woman named Anya, who had a keen interest in local cryptozoology, overheard. She followed a dejected Elias outside. "I believe you," she said quietly. Elias looked at her, seeing not pity, but genuine curiosity and concern in her eyes. Anya took him to the town's tiny historical society archive. Buried in a box of unsorted documents was a journal from the 1890s, written by a settler who had also lived on the edge of the hemlock woods. The handwriting was frantic, deteriorating over the pages. "June 3rd, the black moths came again last night. Their whispers are louder. They show me things, terrible, wonderful things. They say the silver is mine if I but listen. June 17th. I can no longer tell their thoughts from my own. Jeremiah from the farm down the way came asking about his missing dog. The moths showed me where it was buried. I told him. The look on his face. He knew I shouldn't have known. The final entry was a single, scrawled sentence, the ink blotted as if by a trembling hand. They want eyes. They need them to see." Elias and Anya looked at each other, a shared dread passing between them. The missing bird's eyes. It wasn't just a story. It was a cycle. A pattern repeating itself over a century. That night, armed with the journal, high-powered lights, and audio recording equipment, they decided to wait at Ilias's cabin. They had to document it. They had to know, as dusk fell, the fog rolled in, thicker than ever. The woods became a wall of impenetrable grey. The air grew still and heavy. Then came the sound, a low, humming vibration that wasn't heard so much as felt in the teeth and bones. It was the beating of countless wings. They came, not dozens, but hundreds. A living, breathing cloud of darkness, each moth a pupil-less silver eye staring from the void. They blanketed the cabin, blotting out the windows, plunging the world into a moving, whispering blackness. The psychic assault was immediate and overwhelming. Anya cried out, dropping her recorder as the voices flooded her mind, voices of the long-dead settler, of Elias, of her own deepest regrets and desires, all twisted and spoken back to her by the hive mind of the moths. "We are the watchers in the wood," the voices hissed in unison. "We see your past. We know your future. Your eyes will let us see more. Your silence will let us speak." Elias, driven by a primal fear, switched on the high-powered floodlights he'd rigged on the porch. A blinding white light erupted, slicing through the darkness. The reaction was instantaneous and horrifying. The moths didn't flee from the light. They surged toward it, drawn to it with a frenzied, violent hunger. They smothered the lights, their bodies sizzling and popping against the hot glass. But more came, an endless wave of them. The whispers in their minds became a scream of agonized ecstasy in the strobing. Chaotic light of the dying floods. Elias and Anya saw it. The moths weren't just covering each other. They were converging. Their bodies melded and twisted together, their eye-patterned wings aligning, forming a larger, grotesque shape in the air between them. For a single, heart-stopping second, the swarm coalesced into a giant, shimmering, monstrous eye that stared directly at them, seeing every terrified fiber of their being. Then, as the last light died, plunging them into utter blackness, the whispers stopped. Silence. A minute passed. Then another. Elias fumbled for a lantern and lit it. The porch was empty. Not a single moth remained. Just the smell of ozone and burnt chitin. They were gone as if they had never been. They never came back to Ilias's cabin. But the story doesn't end there. A week later, old Sheriff Miller went missing during a patrol near the Hemlock Woods. Search parties combed the area for days. They found his patrol car, keys in the ignition, radio crackling with static. They found his hat, but they never found him. The only clue was discovered by a search dog. Lying in the moss next to the driver's side door was a single, impossibly large moth wing, velvet black, and on it, rendered in perfect, iridescent silver, was a marking that looked uncannily like Sheriff Miller's eye. Elias and Anya never spoke of it to anyone else in town. They knew the truth. The watchers in the wood had taken a new listener, and somewhere... Story 5. The Night Stalker of Willow Creek. Willow Creek was the kind of town that thrived on routine. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests in the Pacific Northwest. It had a population of barely 600, where everyone knew everyone. And the nights were quiet except for the whisper of the wind through the evergreens. But one October, the town learned that even in the most mundane places, something ancient and terrifying could awaken. It began with the disappearances of pets. Dogs, cats, even the occasional farm chicken vanished overnight. No paw prints, no claw marks, nothing but the faintest traces of disturbed dirt and a lingering metallic scent in the air. At first, people assumed coyotes or bobcats, but the pattern grew too precise, too unnerving. Every night, a single house would be visited, a single creature taken, leaving the rest untouched. The first human sighting came from Lena Cartwright, a nurse who lived on the edge of town. Returning home from her late shift at 11:45 p.m., she drove along a dirt path that led to her small cabin surrounded by towering evergreens. The fog was unusually thick that night, wrapping around her headlights in ghostly swirls. That's when she saw it. A massive quadruped, taller than any bear she had ever seen, but with limbs that bent in impossible directions. Its fur was patchy and coarse, mottled grey and black, and its eyes glowed a deep, molten orange fixed directly on her car. The creature moved silently, stalking alongside her for nearly half a mile, its eyes never leaving her. Lena's pulse raced, and she gripped the steering wheel as if her life depended on it. When she finally reached the clearing near her cabin, the creature vanished into the fog, leaving only an oppressive silence and the echo of its amber gaze in her mind. The next night, a group of teenagers dared to explore the old logging trail behind town. Armed with flashlights and fueled by bravado, they laughed at first. But as they walked deeper into the trees, the laughter died. A low growl vibrated through the fog, though no shape could be seen. Then, one by one, glowing eyes appeared between the trunks, dozens of them, hovering just above the ground, watching with an intelligence that was impossible to mistake for animal instinct. The creatures were immense, their limbs long and crooked, their faces elongated, almost mask-like, with jagged teeth faintly visible under the moonlight. Panic erupted. The teens ran, tripping over roots and rocks, scrambling back toward the town, only to hear the creatures glide behind them, silent but relentless. When they reached the outskirts, all that remained were faint paw prints that twisted and contorted unnaturally into the fog. Nobody slept that night, and the town began to whisper. The Night Stalker of Willow Creek was real, and it was learning. The most terrifying encounter came for the Harper family. They lived in a rustic cabin at the foot of Pine Ridge, far from any neighbors. One night, young Jacob Harper, age 9, was awoken by the sound of something scratching at the back door. At first, his parents thought it was a raccoon, but when his father, Paul, went outside with a lantern, the light revealed something that defied explanation. The creature was enormous, crouched low to the ground like a predator, its fur ragged and bristling, limbs unnaturally long, its eyes molten orange, glowing with intelligence locked onto Paul and Jacob. Its jaw opened impossibly wide, letting out a low, melodic growl that seemed to resonate in their chests. Paul fired a shotgun into the air, and the creature froze, tilting its head, before retreating silently into the fog. In the following nights, sightings multiplied. Farmers reported that livestock wasn't eaten but mutilated with precise, surgical-like cuts. Hikers disappeared along the old logging trails. Hunters reported seeing multiple creatures moving in coordination, stalking silently, and communicating through eerie vocalizations no human had ever heard. Every encounter ended the same. The creatures watched, adapted, and retreated before being provoked, but the terror remained, embedding itself into the minds of those who survived. By mid-November, Willow Creek was a town transformed. Windows were bolted, children stayed indoors after dark, and no one ventured into the surrounding woods without a weapon or a guide. Every night, a low, melodic growl echoed through the trees, a haunting lullaby of unseen watchers. Some townsfolk swore the creatures could mimic sounds human voices, the cries of pets, even the tone of a mother calling her child. And when that mimicry happened, people reported that the creatures drew closer. Studying, testing, learning, the Night Stalker of Willow Creek was no ordinary predator. It was intelligent, deliberate, and patient. It didn't just hunt. It observed, learned, and remembered. And as the town discovered, making a sound, even a whisper, in the wrong moment could be enough to draw its attention. The Harper family never felt safe again. Even during the day, the forest seemed alive, every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig triggering a wave of panic. But nightfall was when the terror truly came. The Night Stalker had learned the rhythms of the town and the habits of its people, and it hunted with a patient, intelligent silence that no human could hope to match. One cold November night, the fog rolled in earlier than usual, cloaking the roads and the forest in a suffocating grey. Young Jacob Harper awoke to the metallic scent in the air, the same that Lena Cartwright had noticed weeks ago. His bedroom window, normally covered with frost patterns, was streaked with something darker. Amber eyes reflected in the glass. Dozens of them. He froze, paralyzed by a fear that rooted him to the spot. Sarah Harper tried to comfort him, whispering that it was just a nightmare, but Paul was already scanning the perimeter with a rifle. He noticed movements at the tree-line tour, thin creatures gliding between the trees, limbs bending backward unnaturally. They moved in unison, circling the cabin silently, never making a sound, but radiating a menace so palpable it felt almost alive. Then came the sound. Not a growl or a bark, but something far more disturbing. A melodic mimicry of Jacob's own voice, faint and distant. "Daddy, Mommy, help." It echoed through the fog, growing louder with every second. Paul raised the rifle, but every time he aimed, the sound seemed to shift location, as if the creatures were moving just beyond the limits of his perception. The creatures were learning. They were testing. And the family realized, in the deepest part of their panic, that their own fear, their own movements, were feeding the Night Stalker's curiosity. The next encounter came when the town's hunters decided to confront the creatures. Jed Carlson, the retired tracker, led a small team into the fog-shrouded forest armed with flashlights, shotguns, and an assortment of traps. At first, they saw nothing. Then, a rustling in the underbrush. A pair of glowing amber eyes appeared, followed by another, then dozens more. The hunters froze, realizing that these weren't isolated animals. They were a coordinated pack, intelligent, moving in patterns that defied logic. One of the hunters fired. A deafening blast that seemed to ripple through the fog itself. The creatures paused, tilting their heads as if analyzing the sound. Then, with a terrifying swiftness, they vanished, leaving tracks in the snow that bent and twisted in impossible ways, as though the laws of nature themselves were being mocked. Back at the Harper cabin, the family devised a desperate plan. Using old hunting lanterns and reflective surfaces, they attempted to create a perimeter of light and mirrors, hoping to confuse or repel the creatures. That night, the fog rolled in, thicker than ever, and the Night Stalkers arrived. The creatures glided across the snow, their featureless faces tilted, amber eyes glowing brighter than the lanterns. For hours, the family sat huddled inside, hearts hammering as the shadows circled the cabin, testing every reflection, every movement. Emily Harper, the youngest, whispered to the fog, mimicking the creature's melodic growls. To their astonishment, the Night Stalkers paused. They watched. They listened for the first time. The Harpers realized the communication, however strange or fragile, was possible. Emily's voice, small and trembling, became a bridge between human and monster. The Night Stalkers began to respond with low, harmonic tones, circling slower, tilting their heads in unison. It was as if they were acknowledging her, understanding, but the respite was temporary. One misstep, a cough, a sudden movement, and the creatures shifted instantly, advancing with unnerving speed. Amber eyes filled the fog like lanterns, and the family's fear became a tangible force pressing against their chests. Paul fired a warning shot, the blast echoing like thunder through the forest. The creatures stopped mid-glide, tilted their heads, and retreated, disappearing into the dense fog as silently as they had arrived. By the following morning, Willow Creek was silent again. The forest seemed calm, almost normal, but the residents knew better. Tracks remained in the snow, elongated, twisted, unnatural. Animals were still missing, and the townsfolk who dared venture near the logging trails spoke in hushed tones of the amber eyes that watched from the fog, always observing, always patient. The Harpers eventually moved to the outskirts of a larger town, but the fear remained. Emily, now older, would sometimes wake in the night, whispering melodies into the darkness, and on certain fog-filled nights, she swore she could hear a harmonic reply, a reminder that the Night Stalkers had not forgotten Willow Creek, had not forgotten her family, and were still watching. The legend spread. Warnings passed quietly from neighbor to neighbor. Never venture into the woods at night. Never make a sound, and never, ever attempt to confront the Night Stalkers alone, because they are more than mere animals. They are intelligent, they are patient, and they are always learning. And when they finally act, it is silent, precise, and utterly terrifying. Willow Creek remained a small town, unremarkable by day, but haunted by shadows that only came alive after dark. In the fog, in the woods, in the hearts of those who dared to look and listen. The night stalkers waited, watching every movement, every sound, ever curious, ever patient, ready to strike or perhaps just to learn. Story 6. The Echoes of Stillwater Creek. Alara Vance had always been drawn to silence. After a bitter divorce and years of relentless deadlines as a wildlife photographer, her soul craved the kind of quiet the city could never provide. She drove her beat-up SUV deep into the Pacific Northwest, following roads that gradually dissolved into gravel and mud, until she reached Stillwater Creek. The small town was nothing but a scattering of rustic cabins, hugging the edge of the ancient Whispering Woods, a forest so dense that the sun barely touched its floor even at noon. The general store was her first stop, where Harlan, the grizzled owner, regarded her with suspicion. His face was carved from years of hard living, eyes like river stones that had seen too many tragedies. "You mind the woods after dark, Missy, and you mind what you hear. The woods hear, they talk back. Don't you go answering," he warned. His tone was heavy, not with superstition, but with experience. She nodded politely, dismissing it as local folklore. The first days were The creek sparkled under autumn sunlight, and she captured endless images of deer, owls, and moss-draped trees. She even forgot to check her phone for hours, enthralled by the serenity. But then came the storm on her fourth night of fierce, thrashing wind that rattled the cabin and knocked out the fragile power lines. Lighting her oil lamp, she tried to find comfort in its warm glow. That's when she heard it, a child's voice, terrified and quivering, crying out, "Help me, I'm lost. It's so cold." Her heart leaped. She threw on her raincoat, grabbed her strongest flashlight, and plunged into the storm. Rain stung her face as she called into the darkness, "Hello, I'm here, keep talking." Silence answered. Then, from a direction much closer, the same voice repeated her words, but it was her voice. Her heart froze. "Hello, I'm here, keep talking." She spun, her flashlight slicing through the chaos of wind and branches. The sound came again, this time from just behind a cedar, perfectly mirroring her shallow, panicked breaths. Every step she took was echoed by this unholy mimicry, the sound wrapping around her like cold fingers. She barely slept that night. At first light, she sought Harlan, spilling her story in a trembling rush. His expression darkened. "You met the echo," he said simply. "It's been here longer than any of us. Most times it don't mean harm, but it's curious. It learns sounds, stores 'em up, mimics to lure, to understand, to play. But remember one thing, it's a liar. It only has the sounds it's stolen." Over the next week, the encounters escalated. Her late father's favorite tune, once whistled in her childhood kitchen, floated from a hollow log. Her own camera shutter clicked from a branch before she even pressed it. She heard her ex-husband's ringtone in the dead of the night, distant but perfect. The forest had become a library of her life, cataloguing her most private sounds with terrifying precision. Sleep became impossible. Every rustle, every creak, every distant owl was a potential herald for mimicry. The creature wasn't just observing, it was studying her, understanding her patterns, her fears. She felt watched even in daylight. The forest alive with subtle movements in the corners of her vision. The climax arrived on a moonless night. She sat on her porch, trembling, clutching a cup of tea. When she heard the impossible, the soft, sleepy voice of her 7-year-old niece, Sophie. "Auntie Ilara, I had a bad dream. Can I have a hug?" Ilara's knees buckled. The voice was perfect. The lisp, the tiny cough at the end of sentences, every nuance burned into her memory. "Sophie, baby, where are you?" she whispered, stepping into the ink-black forest. The voice called her further in, coaxing her with every syllable. A twig snapped. She swung her flashlight, and for the briefest moment, the creature revealed itself. It was hunched, pale, limbs grotesquely elongated, clinging to a hemlock trunk like a grotesque sloth. Its skin was smooth, wet, but its face, all lack thereof, was the worst. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a taut membrane, pulsating slightly, vibrating as it perfectly reproduced a stolen voice. It was a living echo chamber, a biological mimic, and it knew her. Ilara didn't scream. She froze, trembling, realizing that her own voice was the trap. The creature didn't pursue her physically, it manipulated her emotions, her instincts. The forest became a theater, the storm a symphony of fear conducted by the mimic. With a rustling hiss like wind through parchment, it melted back into shadow. Leaving her gasping in the mud, she fled the forest at dawn, abandoning the cabin and every photographic proof she had. Her SUV carrying her away from the valley and the malevolent intelligence lurking within it. In the city, surrounded by the hum of traffic and the chatter of people, she sought solace in noise. But the fear never left. On unusually quiet nights, she could swear she heard the faintest echo of her apartment door clicking closed behind her, her sound familiar, intimate and impossible. Sometimes she whispers into the darkness, testing whether it is still listening, and she imagines it deep in the ancient woods, waiting patiently, practicing the cadence of her relieved sighs, learning her laughter, cataloguing every footstep, every word, every quiver of fear. Not to harm her, at least, not yet, but to know her entirely, to possess the library of her life until the day it decides she can no longer resist answering. The echo of Stillwater Creek is patient. It learns, and it never forgets. Even now, thousands of miles away, Ilara can feel it in her memory, the impossibly quiet, perfect mimicry of her life, rehearsing in the shadows, waiting for silence to return so it can speak again. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. TerrorMouth.